Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. And Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. We're very delighted today to have Dr. Jacqueline Ignatova. Did I get it right? Yeah, so we were very happy to have her today as our guest speaker. And she's going to talk about her book, Contesting Africa's New Green Revolution in Ghana, Pro-Poor Agricultural Development or Philanthropy of Global Agribusiness. And before I pass it over to her, a brief introduction. Dr. Ignatova is an associate professor of sustainable development at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. She holds a PhD in government and politics from the University of Maryland, College Park, and an MA in international relations from San Francisco State University, and was a 2012-2013 Fulbright Fellowship recipient for research in Ghana. In addition to her book, Contesting Africa's New Green Revolution, Biotechnology and Philanthrocapitalist Development in Ghana, published in 2021. Her work has been featured in Third World Quarterly and African and Black Diaspora and International Journal. Active in her local food system, she currently serves on the board of directors of her community's Pay What You Can Save. Pay What You Can Cafe. Yeah, so that sounds very cool. Thank you very much for being here today. We look forward to the talk. Now I pass it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Awa, for that warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this Eye on Africa series. And I took a look at it and it looks really exciting. I really appreciate what Michigan State is doing to focus more on issues of African development and culture. And I'm really honored to be a part of it and sharing with you my book, Contesting Africa's New Green Revolution, Biotechnology and Philanthrocapitalist Development in Ghana. And so what I have decided to focus on a bit today is this driving question in my research regarding these so-called New Green Revolution in Ghana, or New Green Revolution in Africa, rather, interventions as it touches down in Ghana, and asking the question of kind of whose benefit are these agricultural development interventions taking place. And so that's why I asked that question, pro-poor agricultural development or philanthropy for global agribusiness. And I'll develop that latter point as the talk proceeds. What you see here is tamale taken from a flight prior to landing in Tamale. Here you can see some of the traditional compounds with the thatched roofs clustered together. And this is also being used as a metaphor with the idea that development planners often kind of see dynamics from above or from somehow outside. And this is drawing upon Timothy Mitchell's work on Egypt in The Rule of Experts, where he talks about the object of development. And in this case, the object of development is African farming systems and the ways in which development planners see a need for transformation of African farming systems, and also kind of perceive their own role through kind of advancing agricultural development interventions as somehow outside. Another point to use that kind of metaphor is that oftentimes what agricultural development planners' intentions are when it comes to how it looks on the ground, there can be rather significant discrepancy. And so I'll also speak to that point in the course of today's talk. And so the roadmap, and so I'm featuring some pictures that can provide evidence that I have in fact been doing research in northern Ghana since December 2011. So you can see how much younger me on the back of this motorcycle. Don't worry, going slow. But this is a bit of how I got around to do a number of the interviews and participant observation in both farming communities and among agricultural development and development planning circles. And I'll speak a little bit more to my methods, interpretive methods, that is a bit later in the talk. And so for today's talk, I'm going to provide an overview and the purpose of the project. I'll highlight some of my key concepts and research questions, method, as well as highlighting findings. And in the middle of the talk, I'll also read an excerpt from the book, addressing the kind of takeaway, which is that the new green revolution in Africa is not new, it's not green, it's not a revolution, and it's not really for Africa. And so I'll explain what I mean by that in the talk. And so as I just gave you a little snapshot of the new green revolution for Africa, this green revolution, just to clarify, what are we talking about here when we talk about the green revolution? We're talking about those mid-20th century agricultural development interventions that largely had their impacts in India and Mexico. Chapter 1 of the book also talks about that it also reached countries within the African continent, but the initiatives were not sustained or they were ill-suited. But nevertheless, where we see a lot of the transformational impact of agricultural technologies, and by this I'm talking about the use of fertilizers, the use of hybrid seeds, irrigation, mechanization, and agrochemicals, helped to kind of transform landscapes in India and Mexico. It is both attributed with India averting famine, with Mexico becoming an export-oriented production country. But as we know, and with more distance, and as Vandana Shiva and others articulate, Yapa is another one that does a great critique that I feature in the book on the negative effects. And so the negative effects of the Green Revolution included not only environmental impacts, right? So as you're using more fertilizers, agrochemicals, hybrids that lose their hybrid vigor after being replanted, but also the Green Revolution produced a lot of social differentiation. So not to say that it didn't exist prior to that, but it deepened those existing inequities. And so the new Green Revolution for Africa is supposed to be a response to these agricultural development interventions that that were supposed to, transform and alleviate poverty through agricultural productivity and increases in farm income, but really that there were certain types of farmers that were able, because they had more capital, because they had more land access, because they were men, were able to benefit more from these agricultural development interventions. The New Green Revolution for Africa intends to respond to those criticisms of deepening social inequities, of the exclusion of women, of environmental impact. But what I am doing in the book and in this talk is critically assessing this framework of the New Green Revolution for Africa. So first point, it's not really new, right? So we have both the continuity in with the first Green Revolution, if you will, with a very input-intensive agricultural development initiatives, meaning requiring very kind of formula-intensive use of agrochemicals, fertilizers, irrigation, mechanization. This is also philanthropist supported. So the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, we see Rockefeller showing up with the new Green Revolution as well as the first Green Revolution, and a use of similar discourse that this is supposed to be a poverty alleviating mechanism for African farmers, just as it was supposed to be for Indian and Mexican farmers and other places in which these agricultural development initiatives touched down. Now, I will acknowledge, and I do acknowledge, especially in chapter 3 of the book, that there is some changes, right? So one thing that I think is really notable, and authors like Lindsay McGoey do a great job of highlighting this, is that in the so-called golden era of philanthropy, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, they kept more of a distance. They didn't want to be in the spotlight like people that we now see, Bill Gates, George Soros, Angelina Jolie, Bono, etc. They are celebrity activists. And so that in itself is a distinction. The Carnegies and the Rockefellers and whatnot during the golden era of philanthropy were concerned about putting themselves in the spotlight, because at that particular cultural context, there was a lot more criticism about the accumulation of mass amounts of wealth. And so I would argue in this particular moment in our history, there's less of that robust criticism about that mass accumulation of wealth that enables philanthrocapitalist development. And I'll explain that a little bit further later in the talk. We also see a changing relationship to seed. And this is something that arguably we can see with Jack Clopenbergsworth and First the Seed, that, commodification of seed was also a feature of the Green Revolution for Africa. But with the development of so-called pro-poor biotechnology, we're actually seeing through genetic engineering, through the use of a transgene with a donation by entities like Monsanto, now Bayer, or Syngenta, that there is this notion of the seed as being something that can be patentable, can be ownable, rather than a feature of culture and a kind of commons. And so I'll speak further and happy to elaborate more on that. And I also use the term and build off the concept of biocapital in creating a distinction between these two moments in agricultural development interventions. So it's not really new, it's not really green. What I am trying to articulate here is that, in fact, a lot of these agricultural development interventions are very energy, very water intensive. They often rely on a lot of monocultural production. So in Ghana, the US program Feed the Future has focus on maize or corn, soy, and rice. So, not a singular crop, but still a limited number of varieties and types of crops grown. And these have significant environmental implications, which I'm happy to elaborate on. And then there's that question of the suitability of this in the context of climate change, whereas we can, genetically modify for drought tolerance, but what about the flooding, right? Because we know that the experiences of climate change are not monolithic. It's not an issue of only drought, but droughts followed by heavy rains and wind. And so myself and others argue that actually what we need at this moment in terms of the future of agriculture is greater agrobiodiversity. Also happy to expand on that point. So it's not new, it's not green, it's not a revolution. And so in the interlude of the book, I talk about the concept of mixers. And this is the idea, and this is me countering this notion that the new green revolution for Africa will be radically transformative. And both proponents and opponents of the new green revolution for Africa programs either will argue that this will alleviate poverty and radically transform the African farming sector and to their African farmers' benefits, or the opponents may argue that this will lead to total corporate domination of food systems. And so what I trace is actually how, and part of my reading that I'll be sharing with you momentarily, is the ways in which, in fact, African farmers, Ghanaian farmers are pragmatic. They try new technologies where it suits them. When there are, promotions or, campaigns that provide farmers with subsidized fertilizers. They're likely to use it, but they integrate traditional knowledge. They integrate land use practices that are not always aligned with capitalist commercialized agricultural systems. So I'm happy to also expand on that further. And then the final point is not really for Africa. And that's what I mean by this critique of, is this pro-poor agricultural development, or is this really philanthropy for global agribusiness? And I really find in my research and in writing the book that it really ends up being a lot more of the latter. And so one of the issues is that it, not unlike the first Green Revolution, is that it's likely to actually increase social differentiation. It may not contribute to climate resilient agricultural systems. It may not actually alleviate any of the gender dynamics, but may exacerbate them. And happy to expand on all of these points later in the Q&A. And so if it's not really for Africa, who is it really for? Who is developing whom? And so this is just to give you an overview of the book. This is a part of the Z. Bloomsbury Politics and Development in Contemporary Africa series. And so chapter 1 provides a more historical account looking at Green Revolution discourse and drawing parallels with the contemporary discourse, as well as this language of the enabling environment for agribusiness. And what the enabling environment for agribusiness really translates into is state initiatives to change things like legislation, plant breeders' bills, biosafety, property rights, et cetera, that really benefit global agribusiness. And so chapter 2 looks at this idea of philanthrocapitalism. And in short, philanthrocapitalism is the merging of the logics of venture capital with that of philanthropy, with this idea that we can have a win-win of both advancing business interests and alleviating poverty. And so I critique this philanthrocapitalism and how it's affected the development sphere by looking at the politics of public-private partnerships. And what ends up happening when we have philanthrocapitalist development is that there ends up being issues of accountability, transparency, even democracy at stake. And I'll be addressing that a little bit more later in the talk. Chapter 3 is on biocapital, pro-poor biotechnology, and legislative changes in the seed sector. And this is where I really drill down to look at, in particular, the development of a transgenic cowpea, what we know in the South at least as black-eyed pea. And so I look at that development and a constellation of partners, including the Savannah Agricultural Research Institute, as well as Monsanto, USAID's Program for Biosafety Systems, Ghanaian development planners, and the kind of contestations around, property, and also the ways in which something that used to be thought of as a commons, such as seed, now becomes commodity. And so that's where I contribute to the literature on biocapital. Then chapter 4 is entitled Technological Savior or Terminator Gene, Biotechnology, Food Security, and the Political Economy of Hype. And so this chapter contributes to ways of understanding how contestation in itself, these kinds of conflicts over things like genetically modified seeds, create this dynamic called what I'm framing as a political economy of hype, where both proponents and opponents participate in kind of these overstatements about either the promise or peril of genetically modified seed, and how this also is really disconnected from African farmers on the ground. And so that pivots into chapter 5, which most prominently features my field work, and that's entitled Experts, Entrepreneurs, and the Last Mile User. And so I will be be elaborating on what that means by giving some illustrations looking at the agricultural technology transfer project seed vans and the ways in which they're getting commercial seed into these distant locations, these village communities. And so then I have the interlude on mixing, which I referenced. And so also just to speak to the image that is on the flyer, that is my dear friend and elder who I've learned so much from, Chris Lazari, who's featured in this interlude, who gave me this kind of notion of mixing. He used it in a different context, but I think it's useful for thinking about how farmers can pragmatically blend together both traditional farming practices alongside new technologies. Then chapter 6 is entitled Neo-Colonial Anxieties. And one of the things I thought was really interesting in my research, talking to both proponents of genetically modified seed and commercialization of agriculture, as well as opponents, actors like Food Sovereignty Ghana. And what struck me is that both proponents and opponents would frame interventions from the outside as neo-colonial. So there were agricultural research scientists and development planners involved in biosafety that would talk about all of this outsized influence of all these so-called anti-groups that were interfering with Ghanaian sovereignty and making determinations about the adoption of genetically modified seed. In the same fashion, we have actors like Food Sovereignty Ghana that similarly framed the promotion of biotechnology in Ghana as a form of neocolonialism. And then I have a brief conclusion, and also happy to address any of these themes in the Q&A if I don't address them well enough in this talk. And so I'm about to read an excerpt from, once again, Contesting Africa's New Green Revolution. And again, driving research questions in whose interest and who is developing whom. And just to plug, the book is now more accessible because it's out on paperback. And so I'll be reading from this for a little bit. And so this is from the preface. When I was preparing my application for a Fulbright fellowship in 2011 to study the unfolding debate around genetically modified crops in Ghana, I knew that I might be a bit early to the scene. I got reassurance by my workshop participation and interviews in DC that Ghana would soon be both a new site for confined field trials of genetically modified crops and a target of new Green Revolution for Africa interventions, promoted by a global assemblage of actors in development, agriculture, and philanthropy. Ghana is the furthest along, quote, with regard to the introduction of genetically modified crops in West Africa, one DC-based development official knowledgeable about global biotech trends told me. Yet, when it came to identifying a Ghanaian anti-GMO or food sovereignty-related activist organization tracking these developments, I came up short. I decided to send an email to Bakari Sadiq Nyari, someone I understood from my office in Baltimore to be a food and land sovereignty activist who had written a compelling expose of biofuel land grabbing in northern Ghana. He had passionately condemned a Norwegian biofuel company that tried to establish the largest tropha plantation in the world for violating the land rights of a community. Quote, bypassing official development authorization and using methods that hark back to the darkest days of colonialism, this investor claimed legal ownership of these lands by deceiving an illiterate chief to sign away 38,000 hectares with this thumbprint. By highlighting this land grab, Nyari's work led to a return of the land to the community and has been used as an example of success by transnational activists in the struggle against land grabs across Africa. A few months following my email, Mr. Nyari wrote that he would be happy to work with me and would connect me to the executive director of RAINS, a Tamale-based NGO that focuses on intergenerational knowledge exchange in agriculture and gender equity work and education. If there was not yet a big debate about GMOs in northern Ghana, I thought an organization like RAINS and Nyari's work on land grabbing would be the likely source of its murmurings. It turned out that Mr. Nyari is far more than a land and food sovereignty activist. Nyari, contrary to my initial impression upon reading his expose, is what's known as a big man in Ghana. And through his former service as national chairman of Ghana's Lands Commissions, has been involved in part of these so-called new Green Revolution interventions I was critiquing. Additionally, Nyari was the director of the Lands Commission's Public and Vested Lands Management Division and the principal lands officer in the Upper East Regional Lands Commission, as well as a part-time lecturer and university lecturer in land economics. He co-owns a hotel with his wife, serves as a principal consultant at Premium Property Consult, has an extensive garden, raises quail, and is growing the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa's jasmine rice varietal. In his capacity as chairman of RAINS, he has supported their work on seed sovereignty and gender equity and has repeatedly stressed its importance. Women play a key role in making this choice of what seed to plant. And so a loss of control over the seed system would disproportionately affect women. In Nyari's words, whoever controls the seed controls the farmer, and whoever controls the farmer controls the food, end quote. Nyari believes that the communal nature of land needs to be protected and has used his positions of authority to do so, and that is his framing, as I discuss further in the interlude. As Nyari told me in one of our interviews, our land really holds us together. And if we destroy its communal nature, we have also destroyed the unity that exists between us, end quote. These views on the need to retain the communal nature of customary land tenure sit in tension with projects such as the World Bank-funded Ghana Commercial Agriculture Project, or GCAP, that advance land's commodification. However, Nyari's influence in the design of the GCAP land bank, mixing lived concerns about land grabs with his expertise in land economics, has led to the specification that only a percentage of the land could be sold in the form of limited time leases, appearing to strike a balance between the realities of rural to urban migration and high land values without denying communities access to land. What gets lost in thinking of Nyari as merely a Ghanaian bureaucrat that implements decisions made by external funders, as some conventional accounts of the new Green Revolution in Africa insinuate, is his diverse concerns and multiple role performances: expert, entrepreneur, activist, educator, community leader. Claims by both proponents and opponents of a new green revolution in Africa and its related introduction of genetically modified crops as wholly transformative obscure the fact that Ghanaian elites have multiple and competing loyalties, that African farmers are pragmatic, and that the work of development always remains unfinished. Rather than a revolution from or termination of traditional farming practices, pragmatic people's science guides farmers' decisions as farmers stay open to new, promising opportunities to resolve the challenges that they face and to improve and diversify their livelihoods. Instead of generating a clear trajectory of outcomes, new green revolution interventions are likely to be mixed with existing traditional knowledge and practices and modified by a range of competing livelihood concerns. Since 2011, my fieldwork in Ghana has enabled me to follow an involving conversation about these new green revolution interventions. My analysis traces the debate around these interventions from a time when few people discussed GMOs and global agribusiness in Ghana, particularly in northern Ghana between 2011 and 2013, to a period when activists marched against Monsanto in the streets of Accra, and educated farmers and students reversed the role of interview subject and asked me for my views on genetically modified crops, unprompted, 2015 to present. I've witnessed shifts in the responses of US development planners from dodging my questions or restricting their answers to off the record, about their long-term views on the transformation of the Ghanaian seed sector, to explicitly stating the goal and role of US interests in these new Green Revolution for Africa interventions. This book is a study of a period of transition. And what I've learned is the product of fieldwork and approached with an ethnographic sensibility, engaged in participant observation and repeated conversations and interviews with a diverse array of key figures involved in Ghanaian agricultural politics between 2011 and 2018. The blend of fieldwork and discourse analysis has informed my core argument. The new green revolution for Africa is not really new, it's not really green, not a revolution, and not pro-poor, as it is implied, but its designation that is for Africa. Allow me to take each of these points in turn. It's not really new, but presenting it as such has important political effects. A look at agricultural policies in Africa in the 1960s and 1970s shows that the Green Revolution programs didn't miss Africa, as proponents of the new Green Revolution for Africa claim. Rather, they were either not sustained or they were ill-suited for the African context. However, as I argue in chapter 1, there are political benefits of framing these efforts to transform African agricultural systems as new and uniquely promising, given how such a discursive framing helps to obscure the role that some of the new green revolutions in Africa's biggest proponents have played in creating the conditions of its supposed necessity. These claims of newness also illustrate the deployment of hype to stimulate technological adoption and philanthropic support. It's not really green. A widespread misinterpretation of these agricultural interventions as green, in that environmentally sound and sustainable, was first brought to my attention when I gave a lecture at a Ghanaian university in 2013. I told the event organizers about my research and gave the title of the talk, Seeds of Contestation, the New Green Revolution in Ghana. Despite the title and the description of the talk that emphasized my critique of initiatives to modernize African agriculture and the use of the language of hotly contested technological models, the flyer image used a strikingly different tone. It showed a rendering of green paper doll cutouts with their hands held to encompass planet Earth. Out of the top of the earth was a single sprout of a seed. In contrast to this common trope of sustainability, the New Green Revolution promotes monoculture and a narrow focus on seeds as technology and a source of new market value, or biocapital. As I discussed in the introduction, monocultural practices reduce diversity and rely more on fossil fuel-derived inputs and mechanization. The potential expansion of a commercial seed sector is likely to reduce the varietals planted and consequently biodiversity, thereby also diminishing an important source of resilience in the context of climate change, and ironically, the source of new commercial traits. Additionally, the wisdom of promoting water-intensive crops such as rice is questionable given the challenges of erratic rainfall and dried up dams faced by smallholder farmers, which I discussed further in chapter 5. While proponents claim that New Green Revolution interventions promote sustainable intensification that reduces the need to expand cultivated areas, the productivist logic that drives these interventions neglects issues of distribution, waste, and the significant dependence on fossil fuels that sustain global agricultural value chains. It's not a revolution. If we take a revolution to mean a sudden, rapid, and complete change, neither the first Green Revolution nor its new version meets that criteria. Rather, as my interlude on what I call mixers highlights, farmers make pragmatic decisions based on what is available within their means and shaped by different forms of knowledge. As such, they are not likely to embrace totalizing technological reform. Although this talk of revolution and transformation dominates conversations among foreign development planners and elites of Ghana, it lacks popular circulation, particularly among farming communities in northern Ghana. The agricultural development interventions denoted as part of this new green revolution require sustained and considerable capital investment, training and knowledge production and dissemination in order to recruit farmers. A particular trope within this new green revolution discourse, used frequently in the Ghanaian context, is that these new green revolution interventions will carry Ghana from farming as a way of life to farming as a business. This suggests that there is an abandonment of the previous spatial temporal position. Farming as a way of life is replaced by a business mentality, but also a radical break from existing forms of knowledge, property, and agency, as I discussed in the introduction and the interlude. Yet, just like the case of Nyari's multiple coexistent roles as expert entrepreneur activists, On the ground, there's quite a bit of friction between these two ideal types. Model farmers chosen to lead some of the New Green Revolution's most prominent interventions in Ghana continue to bring to bear traditional farming wisdom, communal notions of property, and distributive notions of agency, alongside the use of these new agricultural technologies and registered land titles. Rather than being supplanted, these practices are mixed and coexist. Hardly a revolution. This is likely not a surprising finding to anyone who has spent time in the field studying agricultural development or has read Sarah Berry or Paul Richards or Ian Scoons or James Scott. Nevertheless, this discourse of revolution persists and as such needs to be contested. Which leads me to my final point. It's not pro-poor. An anecdote from one of my first contacts I made is illustrative. I had met this professional development assessor through a professor of mine, a former research assistant from a community on the outskirts of Tamale, whose expertise was in monitoring and evaluation. He had worked with a number of NGOs and government agencies on a contract basis. During our first meeting in January 2012, I remarked at the surprisingly high number of NGOs in Tamale, many of which were focused on agriculture and food security. And I asked him how locals felt about this NGO presence. Did they feel that this improved upon their lives? Did it feel invasive? He told me that he thought, quote, more people should study this, as these are interventions into people's lives, and they don't always make people's lives better. Sometimes they make them worse, end quote. He cited an example of a community in the Upper East that had numerous development interventions and no improvement. Why is that, I asked. He said that the aid would not always reach the target beneficiaries. Sometimes they select students that are already brilliant would succeed regardless to show success. What his story suggests is that, again, agricultural development interventions to promote productivity and food security are not new, and that much development assistance continues to reach people that have the means to be successful regardless, rather than choosing beneficiaries that are most in need. Philanthrocapitalism influences many New Green Revolution interventions and exacerbates this already existing tendency in agricultural development to deepen processes of social differentiation. This consultant's story, also reveals some of the paradoxes of humanitarian food security work. He was at the time the single person hired to do the monitoring and evaluation work for the Northern Ghanaian programs of an international NGO. Despite his workload, his employment was paid substantially less than his Euro-American colleagues, some of whom were also provided housing, and his was on short-term contracts. At the time we spoke of it, he was already 6 months into a year-long contract without knowledge of whether he would be renewed, and he worried about what that would mean for his ability to support and feed his large family. The irony of his employment in the domain of food security was not lost on either of us, and learning about his insecure status attuned me to view global food security and development interventions with a more skeptical eye. The presentation of these high modernist agricultural development interventions as pro-poor New Green Revolution for Africa is not only inaccurate, but also deceptive. It obscures the political reality that these interventions sustain a status quo that has been harmful to African development, one that has created the conditions of dependence on Western expertise, even while contradictory and damaging, extracts African knowledge of the use of plants for profit, even while demeaning traditional African farming systems, and uses the cover of pro-poor philanthropy to obscure how it also creates the conditions for the development of global agribusiness that cares little about resource-poor African farmers. If the New Green Revolution for Africa is really none of these things, what are these interventions about? Who is really developing whom? The book seeks answers to questions. And to jump ahead and give you this spoiler, I'll very briefly read a short paragraph from the conclusion. Contesting Africa's New Green Revolution considers how philanthrocapitalism shapes development in Africa today. Through this study of the micropolitics of the New Green Revolution for Africa agenda, I show how efforts in Northern Ghana to transform the Ghanaian seed sector and develop pro-poor biotechnology advance the interests of the private sector in the global north. Development planners present these interventions as growing the local private sector. However, global agribusiness corporations are well situated to take advantage of these legislative shifts, new distribution networks of seeds, and new forms of education and training that promote the professionalization of farming and the commercialization of the seed sector in Ghana. The outcome of these currently unfolding interventions is uncertain and contested. Yet the possibility that such interventions may exacerbate poverty and power imbalances rather than remediate them warrants concern if we are to take seriously the pro-poor aspirations of this work. Thanks for allowing me to read a rather long section of that, but I appreciate my ability to share with you. I took a lot of care in the writing of it. So to speak to some of the themes that I address, and then shortly I'll pivot to Q&A. I just wanted to highlight that a lot of also what we are seeing here, and I'm trying to move this down so you can see the top of the slide. Okay. Pardon me, I'm just trying to see if I can move that. It's the changing landscape of food security interventions in Ghana is what the title should say. And so one of the things that these philanthrocapitalist agricultural development interventions that I'm studying, one of the shifts is to move away from in-kind food aid, such as what's shown here. This is a World Food Program bag of maize from Canada. U.S. Food Aid, Public Law 480, used to bring more in-kind food aid or our own agricultural products to countries such as Ghana. And there is a large body of literature that critiques food aid, speaks to how food aid also alters taste and demand for certain products. This is arguably how Tom Brown, which was a food aid product with Catholic Relief Services and U.S. government distributed it primarily in the South, helped to get people in the South to have a taste for soybean, which previously isn't an indigenous crop and wasn't commonly consumed. But one of the critiques of food aid is that it can undermine the local food system, the local food economy. And so now we see a shift from food aid to capacity building. And that all sounds wonderful, right? We want farmers in African countries to be more productive, to have more income, to be able to have better market access. That all is wonderful and sounds great. And certainly expertise training, new technologies can support that. But in a similar fashion, we can extend similar kinds of critiques of dependency with these capacity building initiatives, especially when the expertise, training, and technologies are not originating, they're not endogenous to the place. And so it always requires a kind of dependency on that foreign expertise. Pro-poor biotechnology, you got a sense of briefly in my excerpt from the book, but this is also something where we're seeing a lot of global partners that include, as I mentioned, USAID's program for biosafety systems, Savannah Agricultural Research Institute, the SEER, based in Kumasi, as well as entities like Monsanto, the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, are all trying to work together to create these transgenic crops that are supposed to address some of the needs of resource poor farmers. But there's also that argument that this is a moment in which they can, these companies like Monsanto or Syngenta that are facing a lot of backlash can reach new markets. ATT seed vans are those that can distribute these seeds. They're primarily involved with distributing more of the hybrid varietals, but once genetically modified seed is available, we might see more distribution of that. And then we also see initiatives such as what was once funded by the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which is also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the West African Center for Crop Improvement at the University of Ghana, Legon, as a PhD in plant breeding. So we're seeing different facets of this kind of capacity building approach to promote food security and poverty alleviation. But again, my book is critically assessing these efforts. And so one of the things that's also of interest is that we have this kind of work of the entities like Monsanto or Syngenta donating a transgene for the development of pro-poor biotechnology. But a lot of this can also be read as a kind of way of public relations for agribusiness giants like Monsanto. If they're seen to be a kind of a force for poverty alleviation rather than man-Satan, that is considerable benefit to them. This also kind of dynamic of philanthrocapitalism, I argue, is also a way of legitimating wealth. We also see that with philanthrocapitalism in development, that we see more focus on entrepreneurs and more focus on measurable outcomes, which also result in focusing more attention on those kind of the so-called low-hanging fruits of development rather than those that need it the most. And so here are some examples when I'm talking about philanthrocapitalist development in Ghana. This is what I mean. So here, this distribution van, you can see some of the funders include IFDC as well as USAID. That's the International Fertilizer Development Corporation. And so this was a donated van to help this commercial seed company reach further into the villages that otherwise would be inaccessible. A lot of my book is also highlighting how figures like Bill Gates have a kind of outsized influence on agricultural development priorities, on development priorities, period, right? Because it's not only agriculture that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is involved in, right? And so to speak to that, I'm just, this is from page 18 or the introduction, to speak to that point about philanthrocapitalism. Here I quote myself, philanthrocapitalism can aid in the pursuit of aims by governments, but given its donor-driven nature, may serve donors far better than recipients. I argue that the increasing prominence of philanthrocapitalist-led development in Africa raises important concerns about accountability, power, and democracy. Furthermore, its expanding role can also be understood as part of the growing governance of humanitarianism. Also happy to expand on that. And so linking this philanthrocapitalist development in Ghana, we can also see that donation as being a feature, and also kind of discuss the Cowpea project. And so I'm looking at the time, perhaps I'll conclude on this slide because I think it's really important, this kind of emergence of or expansion of biocapital, where we can take something that used to be a cultural commons and make it a commodity. And we see this with the development of transgenic cowpea, as I've been mentioning. And so there's one of the things that I traced is this kind of questions of ownership, because one of the features of biotechnology is that it's patent protected or proprietary. And so a lot of my interviews centered around these questions of ownership, where donation was a mechanism of enclosure, where like through Monsanto's donation of the BT transgene, in this parallel instance in Kenya with the Kenyan Agricultural Research Institution, they actually tried to claim, even though it was collaborative, even though it was based off of germplasm from Kenya that they had manipulated, that farmers had been stewards of for generations. And then the National Agricultural Research Institute itself, not to mention other partners, Monsanto tried to claim ownership of it. And even though they failed, it showed their intention, right? And so also I would argue that this donation makes us think about gifts differently. It's not only, it's not a gift from nature, it's a gift from a corporate entity. It suggests that seeds themselves can be owned, can be patentable, that's appropriate, that patenting of life is appropriate. And I think that's a big question. And so what we're seeing in this instance is that these dynamics facilitate the commodification of life. There's a relationship between philanthrocapitalism and biocapitalism, also happy to expand upon that. And so one of the things that I also really, gets me upset about this is that when you have this entity like Monsanto, now Bayer, trying to claim that it leads to the erasure of the role of farmer experimentation and their contributions, right? And so all of this, I asked the question of who benefits and whose interests, and also point to, whereas it makes sense when you have national agricultural research institutions that don't have a lot of resources. Of course, it makes sense to receive bilateral assistance from entities like USAID, or to receive support from agribusiness. But at the same time, there are opportunity costs. That money could be going into supporting existing crop research for crops and traits that maybe are more aligned to what communities' needs are. And so I think that's an important point, and I will conclude on that. I'll just quickly skip to the end so I can show you my email address. I'm happy to take in any additional questions or comments, start a relationship if you're interested in this work. And so with that, I think I will stop my presentation and turn it over for any questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And you can type your questions if you want to raise your hand also and be unmuted, allowed to speak, you can do so. And I was interested at the very beginning when you talk about structural adjustment. So I wanted to know more. What's the link there?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great question. And so if you're interested in this, the book, it's in chapter 1. So basically, one of the things I found really interesting in looking at the history of structural adjustment is that a lot of the same players that, like if we look at the World Bank, for example, the World Bank has obviously played a really important part in structural adjustment and getting countries through conditionalities attached to their loans to be more fiscally conservative, meaning cutting back on social expenditures. And this had a really pronounced effect on agricultural research and development, on extension services, among other kinds of agricultural related aspects. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight in the book is that it's the same players that are now, not even ironically, telling farmers that they ought to, or telling Ghanaian development planners rather too, that they ought to, work on building their rice sector, work on, spending more money on agricultural development. And it's the same players that told the Ghanaian government and other African governments, other developing countries that were subject to structural adjustment. Now, they were told in the past that they needed to cut back. And so a lot of the kind of circumstance in which these new Green Revolution for Africa interventions insert themselves is in that context of weakened agricultural research institutions because of the legacy of structural adjustment, as well as the legacy of trade liberalization. So the rice sector, rice is one of the 3 U.S. the future programs kind of target crops. And, the rice sector, it's not a matter of Ghanaians not knowing how to cultivate rice. In fact, Guinea is the locus of, which is not far, is the locus of African rice, right? So rice has a long history in the region. What happened to the Ghanaian rice sector was actually trade liberalization. So with the opening, and this was part of conditionality, with the opening up of those borders, it flooded the market with heavily subsidized, for example, U.S. rice, and Ghanaian farmers simply could not compete. And so that is, one illustration of what I'm speaking to. Thanks, Alva, for that question.
Thank you very much. I think there is one question. Yeah, the presentation will be available. We'll post it on our website maybe by next week. And patent ownership, there is a question, I think, about patent.
Yeah, pulling it up. How can local farmers and activists address the patent ownership legally and create a class action lawsuit as agricultural warfare? I really appreciate this question. I mean, one of the things I think is important to recognize is that adoption of genetically modified seed is a choice, right? And so I have been working with Food Sovereignty Ghana since I've been doing this research. Edwin Buffer, I consider a friend and a great colleague I've learned from over the years. And one of the things that we talked about is how, activists can also just kind of raise awareness about these kinds of crops, because I don't think it's a given. The dynamics are quite different than in the US context where GM seed really took hold. I don't think it's a given that it will take hold in Ghana. And I think that there are, there is that really important question that's being raised about patents and about ownership. A class action suit, I can see that taking place more in, say, like the US or Indian or Pakistani context, where there have already been farmers that have been directly affected by adverse decisions like the Percy Schmeiser versus Monsanto decision by the Canadian Supreme Court, where even though it was an instance of biopollution, a cross-pollination of the genetically modified plant with another canola plant, and he replanted it because, that's his livelihood. They actually upheld Monsanto's claims to ownership. And I think those kinds of decisions need to be challenged. It's harder, I think at this stage, it's hard to envision a class action suit because it's still not commercially available in the Ghanaian context. But I appreciate that. I hope I addressed the question. And then also, there's been a lot of debate led by Food Sovereignty Ghana, the Center for Indigenous Knowledge and Organizational Development, or CICOD, has also been important. The Gaia Foundation has also funded a lot of this work. But also just the critiques of what was first called the Plant Breeders Bill. My book kind of reflects that terminology, but now it's called the Plant Variety Protection Act. So there's been a lot of effort to try to challenge its current form, where it really privileges global agribusiness. One of the ways it does so is because of the requirements in order for something to be patent protected, for it to be uniform and stable and kind of commodifiable. And that disadvantages and unique. And that disadvantages local farmers because they don't operate in laboratories that can create the conditions of uniformity and stability. But then again, that only extends the kind of notion that seeds, plants can be patentable. So that is a direction that I'm not sure we want to go into. So, I mean, I think what we're also speaking to is a really a larger kind of concern about the role of capitalism, right? So capitalism normalizes intellectual property protections. And so I think that in itself is something we need to consider.
Thank you. And Mama too, you said to enable the chat. I think it's enabled. You can type your question. You can also use the Q&A section, or you can raise your hand if you have a question. There is another question for you.
Okay.
Big corporation.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. How can we call out big corporations to help drive the shift towards capacity building since they hold so much influence here? Great question. How do we hold big corporations accountable? I mean, one of the things too, in terms of the connection to capacity building, they are involved in capacity building. I think sometimes, a lot of what I do is discourse analysis. So I look at this terminology of capacity building, and some of it again can create conditions of dependency. And I think one of the things that's also troubling with the new Green Revolution for Africa interventions is that it's part of a kind of privatization of agricultural extension kind of support. And so that's something that also has to be called out, because what we're also seeing is a shift where corporations are actually playing parts in not only in distributing their products, but also part of what I witnessed too on a smaller scale. So more small business corporations were the ones that were providing the trainings and the use of the products. And, that in itself is also troubling, because that can create a conflict of interest, right? Someone that's a retailer for agrochemicals doesn't necessarily have the same incentive as an environmentalist to tell you to be careful about the use of that product. What I would also say is that I think I'm really interested in reparations. And I think that rather than, a lot of what we see in terms of our relationship, coming from the US context and our relationship to African development and the African continent, is that we frame a lot of the work as aid. And I think that that language of aid obscures that, as many people that critique food aid talk about, it obscures actually that aid is sometimes also aid to ourselves, right? So food aid has its origins in being a way of distributing surplus, so we could retain high prices for our crop commodities and to not have to pay storage costs, right? And so I think that one of the things I would like to see is more attention to the ways in which big corporations, bad practices have produced this legacy of negative effects, whether we look at social inequities or environmental effects, contributions to the climate crisis, and that they ought to pay reparations. And I think that would be a significant power shift if we frame that work rather than as aid, where they can claim to be the white savior, but rather as reparations, which acknowledges that there has been some wrongdoing that needs to be rectified. So I don't know if I fully addressed your question, but always love an opportunity to mention reparations. So,
Thank you. I am from Senegal, and I have been following the news there. And I'm not an expert in agriculture at all, but one of what's happening right now, what people are talking, and I'm wondering if this is somehow related to this green revolution, is how farmers now are becoming paid laborers.
mm-hmm.
Now, instead of cultivating their farms, now they are paid by big business or entrepreneur. And I was just wondering your take on that, and if you have seen something similar in Ghana, for instance.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. Absolutely, there's definitely a connection. And I would say that what we are seeing is often it's structured around like what's called nucleus outgrower contracts in the Ghanaian context. And so this is, it's something we've seen before. It's contract growing. And, the implications of that is that farmers then don't have the same choices in terms of what to grow. It's grown. Now, the flip side of that is that they have a guaranteed market that the product is going towards to that nucleus farmer that then interfaces with the kind of middlemen and distributors and processors, retailers, and whatnot, and global value chains or local value chains. But what is happening when farmers become farmers are transformed from farmers to contract growers is that there's just not as much choice. And I would also say that there's a lot of risk involved that is kind of pushed downward. And I saw this with some of the work to expand upon mango value chains in northern Ghana. And a lot of these producers, I attended a mango value chain workshop. This was actually funded by GIZ out of Germany. But this is, it was an initiative in which farmers were being given, these well, I don't know at what stage they were given, but nevertheless, they were held responsible for growing mangoes, particularly those that were destined for European markets. And what they were given was actually varieties that were really ill-suited for the climate context, and actually started flowering just at the moment when the heat was the strongest. And so they did really poorly. And so even though there was all this promise, oh, wow, you're integrating into these global value chains, they weren't able to realize a lot of the benefits because the mango trees just didn't do very well, because it wasn't a culturally, climate context appropriate choice of varietal. It was a choice for the destined market, what Europeans wanted to eat, for example. And so when farmers no longer become more like contract growers, those are some of the risks involved, and certainly has food sovereignty implications as well, in terms of that lack of choice, lack of power. It also is implicated in some land use changes where land has been allocated to more productive farmers, and people have even been displaced off their land. So yeah, excellent question, and I see some commonalities in the Ghanaian context. Thank you.
Wonderful. You have one question in the Q&A section.
What are some criticisms leveled against your book in academia? Oh, thank you. I am still, it's one of those things, you put a book out into the world and you have to wait for for those criticisms to appear. I mean, certainly I'm still and encourage anyone to write a review. I've been fortunate to have some glowing reviews on the back of the book. And so I just wanted to kind of address, that the criticisms can be delayed. So I'm still waiting for more of them. But certainly I think there's a kind of sense that when I speak about food sovereignty, when I speak of these critiques of aid, when I delivered my book talk at the University for Development Studies, I think that sometimes my criticism gets viewed, and also my elevation of the notion of food sovereignty gets framed as overly idealistic, as if African governments are not in a position of power to say no to these kinds of forces and entities. And so that would probably be the main one that I would say that comes up. I also get some defensive kind of in critiquing biotechnology, especially in the US context. There's a lot of proponents, but a lot of my kind of work is more on the economic critique. So I largely consider myself a political economist and a political ecologist. And so I'm really looking at, the risks, the economic risks involved, and what happens to, the cultivation choices in communities and the lack of diversity. But certainly I've heard that, we are facing not only the climate crisis, but with population increases, we need to find ways of producing more food, has been another criticism. But I would also say to that, there is a heck of a lot of food wasted. About a third of the world's food produced is actually wasted. And there are different dynamics in the US context and the African context. So in the US context, it might be wasting away in our refrigerators or in supermarket dumpsters in places like Mali or Ghana. It might be on the field where people can't get it to the market or get bruised on the way to market because the roads are poor. But I would say in terms of that kind of angle and emphasizing the need to produce more, I say, well, there's a lot of waste. So I don't know if that's correct. Thank you so much for that question.
Okay, any more questions or comments? So one more question from me. I'm guessing you talk to the farmers. Are they aware? What's their level of awareness about these modified seeds? And how do they take it?
I would say it's certainly changed since I first started doing work there. I actually got support through a Fulbright fellowship to do my doctoral dissertation work. And I framed it around, trying to understand farmers' perceptions of GM seeds. But at that point, when I started my Fulbright in 2012, it was much too early. It was really very few farmers, mostly with connections to the West, that understood genetically modified seed and the implications. And so I think that awareness of GM seed has changed over time. I will say that one of my observations is so one of the things in terms of biosafety that is required is that in developing these new technologies, there's supposed to be awareness creation and what's called sensitization workshops or seminars with the local communities where people are invited to be a part of and kind of told about the new technology. But what I found, I've seen two different presentations. And what I found is that the information was really biased. And when I spoke to that bias, and bias in favor and highlighting kind of the productivity and the pest resistance and things like that, but not talking about, some of the socioeconomic risks of it being expensive, some of, the findings that we're experiencing in the US where there's resistance to some of these traits and need to further stack traits and things, further stack genes in order to reduce the resistance. There's also a downplaying of the kind of need for refuge zones or basically allotting a certain amount of the land and the crop to conventional varieties that then basically the pests would seize in order to slow down resistance. And a lot of those kinds of things I don't think we're communicating very effectively in the sensitization seminars. So I would assume that if those things have had a good reach, and since I published this in 2021 and I'm doing a different project on women's relationship to trees and food sovereignty issues, happy to address that as well. I haven't been speaking as much with farmers about their views on GMOs most recently, but I would assume that it may be on the whole more positive because of the nature of those presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then I see, how do you see the position of the SDGs? Thank you, Julia. So I would say, Michael Spann wrote a great piece on the SDGs and the politics of poverty. I can't remember the exact title, but if you look that up, you can see Michael Spann's critique, Politics of Poverty, I know features in the first part of the article title. But I would say, one of the things with the SDGs, obviously, this is a hugely complicated multi-stakeholder process. I think the intentions are there to do good work, to try to encompass a lot of different actors and interests and people from all around the world in designing those goals. But I would agree with Michael Spann's critique that in terms of the ones related to agriculture, we see a lot of influence of global agribusiness and how things are kind of framed in terms of like how again, like I was talking about with that critique of capacity building. I mean, I think certainly that can be more beneficial than food aid that might disrupt the local food economy. And again, food aid can be very appropriate in instances of emergency or crisis. But sometimes, with our very slow food aid machine, where, sometimes it can take 6 months or more to arrive at the destination, it can be very disruptive. And I think that, the language around the SDGs as it pertains to agriculture and food security, I think isn't nearly as attentive to food sovereignty concerns. And I really see the imprint of global agribusiness interests there. And I just don't think that's appropriate in the context of the climate crisis. I think that actually we have a lot more to learn from African farmers than the reverse, that actually African farmers have been working with environments that are challenging without many resources, and that actually we ought to understand better their resilience and their farming systems and their traditions and try to foster and uplift them rather than trying to transform them. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I don't see any more questions, but I was just wondering if you can comment a little bit. I'm interested how it works. Pay What You Can Cafe.
Oh yeah. Hey, thanks for that question. So yeah, I'm honored to be a part of the board of F.A.R.M Cafe, and that stands for Feed All Regardless of Means. And it's part of the network of One World Everybody Eats. And so Renee Bowman is the founder and a dear friend, and privileged to get to work with her and Elena Dalton, who is now the executive director. And so it's a really interesting design. It's also a little bit different than some of the One World Everybody Eats cafes, because it's also intended to support the local food system. So even though it's pay what you can or donate what you can, it is linked up. So we do a lot of local food sourcing. So we have great partnerships with local farmers. People can donate more. We have a suggested amount. You can donate more than the amount. You can donate what you can. Actually, I have a little token I can show you. I always keep this at my desk in case someone needs it. So this is a little F.A.R.M Cafe token. And what's cool about this is that this is good for a meal, and you can be gifted this. This was a gift from one of my graduate students that I worked with, and I can gift it to somebody else, and no one has to know your story. So it's a really dignified way of people getting what they need without having, sometimes the dynamics in soup kitchens can have these kind of power imbalances, and people may not feel a part of, of a larger community. And one of the things I think that's really special about F.A.R.M Cafe is that it's really a community cafe. Everyone is welcome. And it's like, I would say in my community, it's probably the best kind of cross-section of all kinds of people that come in. And, people that may be unhoused, sitting next to professors, next to lawyers, sitting next to farmers, children, all of this. It's a really welcome space. And people can also, if you work an hour, then that you can also get a meal that way. And it's been a really gift to the community. And I'm so grateful that we have such a community. And if you guys are interested, I know Renee is always excited to talk with other communities about, starting a Pay What You Can cafe.
Wonderful. Sounds very fun. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your research and about your cafe. I find it very interesting.
Yeah, come visit.
Since we don't have any more questions and comments, and we are also almost out of time, I want to thank you again, and thank you everybody who came today and attended, asked questions. This is our last Eye on Africa of the semester, so we'll hopefully see you next fall, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you once again. It was an honor.
Ignatova for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.